Romantic love is in crisis. We all want it, but somehow it's never the same as in books or movies. People say that as if they suppose that love, as it is portrayed in popular culture, is what represents the unattainable romantic ideal. Romantic love is a fantasy we all crave. It is a fantasy that we all have this special someone out there for us, that this special someone will make us whole, someone who will make us happy. Romantic love is a perfect, unattainable fantasy. Except when it's not perfect. For some reason, romance media that should supposedly reflect our ideals of romantic love are riddled with unhealthy relationships, and sometimes, as critics say, even romanticize or glorify toxic behaviors. Stalking, obsession, control, sexual assault, and non-consent fantasies always seem to haunt romantic narratives for some reason. Romance is said to be female fantasy. It is a genre that has perfected the art of offering to its mostly female readers what nourishes their fantasies. A reader's review of 50 Shades of Grey says, "Every man should read this book in order to understand what women want from a man." Which sounds concerning when the book in question seems to romanticize male domination, reinforce traditional gender roles, and glorify toxic relationships. If romance is female fantasy, then why is it sometimes so toxic? What's the fascination with bad boys and red flag characters? Why do women's fantasies seem to be caught up in patriarchy? Do we secretly want it? Is that the ideal love that we dream of? Do we dream of male domination? My name is Dinara, and my favorite book in my teenage years was Twilight. And even though I was exposed to its dangerous and problematic tropes at such a tender age, I somehow managed to grow into a sane adult. I spent my free time reading manga, webtoons, and just regular novels, and I seem to enjoy stories that depict both healthy and unhealthy romantic relationships, depending on the story, writing, and characters. I don't necessarily disagree with the critique of toxic romance, but I do think that it can be somewhat unhelpful. It seems to involve a lot of self-righteous anger and fist-shaking and asking, how is it still allowed? Who are the women who read it? And of course, concern for the minds of young girls who may be extremely susceptible to these dangerous tropes. But despite all the critique, these problematic tropes remain to be extremely popular with the audiences all over the world. And I want to understand why. Why is bad boy romance still popular in this day and age? Why do the same problematic tropes seem to emerge in completely different cultures? Is that all because of our internalized sexism or natural female masochism? Why do readers seem to crave atavistic romantic narratives? I want to understand it. Chapter 1. What is a fantasy? So, if we agree with the idea that romance is female fantasy, then the first question we should ask ourselves is, what is a fantasy? The simplest and dumbest answer to this question would be that fantasy is something that is, not real. There's this term called the suspension of disbelief. It's when you put aside your logical thinking or skepticism while enjoying a story. Even though you know that the story might not be realistic or believable, you accept it as it is for the sake of entertainment. For example, we know that dragons and nightwalkers in Game of Thrones don't actually exist in real life, or that the stunts in Fast and Furious defy the laws of physics. But we don't question how it's possible, we just go along with it to enjoy the experience. Critics usually have no problem assuming that readers understand that fantasy is not real. But not when it comes to romance, apparently. For some reason, critics worry that romance enjoyers are not capable of suspension of disbelief, because their itty-bitty brain just won't allow them to. For some reason, they worry that women can't tell fantasy apart from reality. Another way to explain what fantasy is to say that fantasy is something that you dream of, or something that you're told you should dream of. It is your ideal, something that you secretly want. If something is present in a fantasy, it always has this pinkish tint that makes you see circumstances or people in an overly rosy or optimistic way, ignoring any negative aspects. Hence the words like romanticize and glorify. So if there is a problematic behavior that is present in a romance story, let's say stalking, and if that story gets a happy ending where the stalker ends up getting the girl, and if that behavior is not properly addressed, well, that means that in that story, stalking is romanticized and glorified, right? And by the way, properly addressing, of course, means, for example, a character saying something like, By the way, did you know that stalking is wrong and it makes me uncomfortable? And then the perpetrator replies something like, oh shoot, I've never thought about it before. Thanks, I won't stalk people anymore. Or another way of addressing would be to have the author punish the character. It's like there is a flowchart that allows anyone to easily determine whether a piece of media is harmful to humanity. Yay! But I think that fantasy is not as simple as a dream come true, and that problematic tropes and behaviors that are present in romance are not automatically romanticized or glorified. Illouz, in her book about 50 Shades of Grey, argues that in its psychoanalytical meaning, the fantasy that is so prevalent in popular culture manifests both unspoken desires and anxieties. It understands you without you having to speak. It works around reality, incorporates it, defends the self against reality, and yet helps one live with it. Fantasy symbolically resolves one's fears and anxieties. It is therapeutic in a way because it finds a pleasurable outlet for them. It addresses conflicts and deprivations and helps resolve them. It's one of the reasons why sometimes stories with problematic and potentially even triggering elements, stories that portray some specific kinds of collective but individually experienced pain, so often become culturally resonant because they first formulate a problem that all readers are supposed to recognize, and then find a pleasurable outlet for it, a compelling and simple enough solution for the said problem. Fantasy in popular culture doesn't just give you the dream to dream, but rather tells you that your dream can be achieved despite all the obstacles. It's like self-help books on how to achieve your dreams, but in the format of fiction. As Illouz says, popular culture then provides a sense of direction. It says clearly and unambiguously, this is how things should be done. The most therapeutic fantasy might be the one that recognizes your fears and anxieties. Perhaps fantasy requires some problematic elements, even some toxicity, for the readers to use it as a coping mechanism. Maybe we actually need pain in our media for the fantasy of it being soothed. Chapter 2. Romance as a battle. So in that case, if a certain piece of media, a genre or a trope, is popular amongst women, it means that it manifests not only the desires of its female readers, but also formulates and resolves their anxieties. That's why women's popular culture incorporates all these problematic themes, because its purpose is to somehow process and resolve them in a fictional setting. Solutions that might not necessarily be applicable to the real world somehow work in that fantasy space. And I think it's not only about the solution. Just the fact that your pain and problems are recognized somewhere in fiction might already provide some relief and a place of belonging. Berlant, in her book The Female Complaint, argues that what she calls women's culture works by telling women that there is a collection of experiences that all women share, and that those experiences make them women. She argues that women's culture promises a certain experience of belonging and provides a complex of consolation, confirmation, discipline, and discussion about how to live as a woman. Or in other words, the narrative of women's popular culture, and that includes romance, both construct and resolve the fears and anxieties that supposedly all women have. So maybe the most resonant pieces of female-oriented media successfully recognize the problems that women deal with, such as abuse, stalking, or misogyny. Or maybe they somehow soothe our anxiety about the world, where we still feel unsafe or not in control. In real life, no matter how far we've come with feminism, we're always reminded of our obstacles. Sometimes it might even feel like we're going backwards, because around the world, conservative political movements that advocate for traditional gender roles keep gaining more and more supporters. And don't get me started on the news. We keep getting bombarded with articles about women getting abused or killed, about them suffering at the hands of bad men. We're used to this, used to women being victims. We're told not to wear revealing clothing, not to walk the streets at night, but none of it really makes us feel safe and in control. So maybe that's why some of us need a power fantasy in our fiction to soothe all of these fears and anxieties. So then what if the problematic behavior of male characters in romance, the stalking, the obsessiveness, the violence, the not taking no for an answer, is meant to represent not the romantic ideal, but the reader's anxieties and fears? What if the reason men in romance can be threatening and dangerous or just simply mean and cruel is for the fantasy of being able to handle them, deal with them, or better yet, bringing them to a point of surrender. As Susan Elizabeth Phillips puts it, sometimes in romance, the female reader finds her fears personified in the character of the virile and powerful rogue male, a character who serves not only as the hero of the novel, but also more subtly as its villain, a potent symbol of all the obstacles life presents to women. If a guy threatens to kill you for some reason in real life, for example, you really are, well, quite powerless against him. But in romance, the heroine always has some power over that guy. In real life, our best bet for dealing with male aggression is getting the police and the state to protect us against it. In real life, we may feel frustrated because we can't really do anything about the bad and the powerful. But in the space of fantasy, characters discover a way to defeat them. For example, in adventure stories, a hero might eventually find a way to defeat the powerful villain by becoming stronger and more proficient at violence, or by getting some equally strong friends to fight alongside him. But in romance, the heroine also finds a way to defeat the powerful villain who poses a threat to her and sometimes to everyone else, by being so brave and kind and noble and caring that the villain falls in love with her. The heroine defeats the villain by saving him, by helping him work out his pent-up emotions and trauma that made him become the villain in the first place. These characters most often don't want to fall in love. They don't want to become dependent on anyone because they see it as a weakness, which is why for them, love is a threat to their power and status, and therefore falling in love for them means being defeated. That is not a romanticization of the villain's behavior. It is a power fantasy of pacifying your aggressor on your own, a fantasy of the powerful surrendering before the powerless, a fantasy of taming the scary beast. When I start a story where there is a dangerous guy, a domineering bad boy who is selfish, cruel and mean, and it's a romance, even if I feel intimidated by his character, I also feel somewhat excited. Excited to see him fall, to see him defeated, because I know that all romances end with the guy getting his ass kicked, metaphorically, crawling at the heroine's feet and begging her to stay with him, sometimes metaphorically and sometimes not. I want to see him crawl. Sometimes the romance hero has to be the most obnoxious bad guy, so that we can get the satisfaction of seeing the heroine bring him to the point of surrender. You might even argue that the romantic hero is not a man at all. Sometimes he is a Frankenstein of all the scary traits women seem to associate with masculinity, but tamed in accordance with the logic of the romantic fantasy. Contrary to what everyone seems to believe, the red flag male lead, the problematic hero, is not meant to represent an ideal guy all women want to date. No, he's the boss the heroine is meant to defeat. Sometimes he's the literal boss. And just like in action stories, the more powerful he is, the more fun he is to beat. Sometimes romance takes the form of a battle in which the heroine always wins. Cardan, the character of the Cruel Prince trilogy, is literally the heroine's bully. He is her tormentor. And I hated his guts, obviously. And I was happy to see him crawl, metaphorically. Almost all the male characters in Nina the Starry Bride are powerful and intimidating assholes, which is exactly why seeing Nina handle them and tame them is so satisfying. She is literally a little girl who has nothing but her own determination and bravery in the world that tells her that she's weak and powerless, that her life is worth nothing, and that the point of her existence is to become someone else's pawn or property. The reason why bad guys exist in romance is the same exact reason why bad guys exist in adventure stories, because the journey to their defeat is fun. It just is. One major difference, though, is that in romance there are certain lines that heroes usually don't cross. Whatever they do, their actions have to be at least somewhat forgivable, because if they do cross the line, the story becomes dark and bitter and loses its fantasy elements. For example, Colleen Hoover's It Ends With Us clearly crosses that line several times, which left some readers feeling betrayed or traumatized because they were expecting a comforting fantasy. The manga Please Save My Earth also crosses some lines. There were certain scenes that were certainly written to make the reader uncomfortable, and some acts that were unforgivable. However, even those stories that follow a romantic relationship between people are usually labeled as romance in their genres. That doesn't mean that everything that happens in a romance is considered romantic, ideal, or desirable by the readers. We don't fantasize about the villains themselves. We fantasize about defeating and saving them. And you might argue that the fantasy of saving the villain is problematic, because savior complexes are quite dangerous in real life, especially in abusive relationships. Maybe women enjoy this fantasy because they were raised with cultural expectations to do the emotional labor of saving men from their pent-up feelings and helping them understand their trauma. Yes, that's true, but still, isn't it, I don't know, a nice fantasy? In real life, no amount of emotional labor from anyone will be enough to save a person who's not willing to reflect on their actions and behavior. That's what makes emotional labor so exhausting, because usually it never ends. But in romance, it does. The villain gets saved. Sometimes even the world gets saved. But why do we think that defeat by violence is normal and defeat by empathy is not? Aren't we allowed to at least dream of kindness and compassion saving the world? Without these fantasies being shot down by concerned critics who worry that we aren't smart enough to understand that this kind of thing doesn't always happen in real life. We don't need a reality check. Reality is all around us. Chapter 3. Who is the villain? And here's another thing. It seems like when it comes to this saving the villain trope in romance, people automatically assume that it's a representation of women doing emotional labor. After all, the heroine is a woman, and the traumatized angry hero is a man. It comes with the assumption that the hero is always the other with a capital O. But is that right though? Why do we assume that romance readers can only empathize and identify with the characters of their own gender? In fact, scholars argue that romance readers are actually pretty capable of identifying not only with the heroine, but also with the hero. It makes perfect sense because we are used to consuming media with male protagonists as default. And quite often, although not all the time, romance novels are written from both the point of view of the heroine and from the point of view of the hero, either from a third-person point of view or with chapters split between the two characters. Shoujo romance manga and Korean romance fantasy webtoons often have whole chapters dedicated to male characters and their perspectives. More often than not, we see and read scenes where the heroine is not even present to begin with. Linda Barlow and Laura Kinsale argue in their essays that readers actually identify with the hero a lot, sometimes even more than with the heroine. The reason for that might be because male characters in romance get to behave in an aggressive way that we don't get to behave like in real life. They get to be mocking and arrogant, they get to be cruel, they get to be angry enough to do selfish and stupid things. Women and men are socialized in different ways and have different gender roles and behavior expectations from the roles that are pushed onto them. But that doesn't mean that we as human beings are only capable of expressing behaviors and experiencing emotions that are culturally assigned to our genders. Of course not, but we do tend to suppress the inappropriate emotions and pretend we don't feel them. Which is why, in romance, the primary role of the hero is to provide us with the means of facing and accepting the angry, aggressive, sexually charged components of our personality that we have been taught to associate with masculinity. In other words, female readers might find a sort of outlet in these bad boy male characters, who have the freedom and audacity to do the things they can't. Barlow actually has a passage in her essay where she describes being obsessed with this male character she was writing, this constantly angry and very cruel character, and she didn't understand where this obsession with him came from until she realized that that character actually represented her own pent-up anger that she couldn't express in real life, so she kind of lived vicariously through him and his violent crimes. The reason why people like villains in general, regardless of the genre, is because they can relate to them. The internet is full of articles and videos about times when the villain was right. The bad guy in stories is quite often something more than an evil symbol to be defeated. We are fascinated by them because we understand them. Which is why I think that a lot of the time we enjoy romances with problematic heroes, because we can relate to them. Hananoi from A Condition Called Love is such a relatable character, because he's anxious and obsessed with the idea that he'll find this perfect love that will save him from loneliness. Is his behavior problematic? Of course it is. But you know what? Humans are generally very problematic beings. We need problematic characters because they understand the deepest, darkest parts of us that we sometimes can't even admit exist. Even Xiong from Please Save My Earth, who is a clear anti-hero, has moments that are scarily relatable. The problematic male characters in romance exist not because we romanticize them, but because we are them, because sometimes we understand them a lot more than the perfect, all-forgiving heroines. I feel like, more often than not, I'm not a kind and understanding enough human being to be able to relate to the heroine. I admire the heroine. I admire her kindness and her strength. I admire her willingness to understand the people around her. But I relate to the problematic and imperfect hero. In the saving the villain with kindness scenario, it is I who gets saved. In real life, I may put expectations on myself to understand others, but in the fantasy of romance, I finally get to be the emotionally mature baby who has no desire and no capacity to understand my own emotions. I finally get to be at the receiving end of someone's emotional labor. Problematic hero represents the dark, cynical, avoidant, toxic part of me that I usually hide, that I have to hide. They have the freedom and the audacity to do whatever the hell they want and not give a damn. They get to have no filter, they get to be free, while I have to spend my whole life walking on eggshells and caring about other people's feelings more than my own. Becoming a villain who will inevitably get saved at the end is a safe way to explore some darker emotions. We might be inclined to interpret this kind of romance as perpetuating the idea that women have to do the emotional labor. But what if it's the fantasy that allows the reader with pent-up emotions to finally experience what it's like to be around a human being who tries her best to empathize with you? Because I don't know about you, but I definitely need a Hotaru in my life. Chapter 4. Consent. And there is another emotion that both men in real life and men in fiction are free to experience. And that is desire or lust. Something that women are told they are not supposed to have, because women who admit to having sexual desire and act upon it are called easy, promiscuous, and a bunch of other disgusting names. I don't know about you, but I was told in high school by my biology teacher that if a girl has more than one sexual partner, then her future children might have their traits. That theory is called telegony and has been disproven long ago, yet somehow it still made it to my biology class in 2011. I grew up being told that my sexuality is shameful, that I should repress it, that I should never feel desire because it's dangerous and will end up with me being taken advantage of. Of course, if I succumb to my desire, it is I who will be used and discarded like used goods. It's not like I can use a man myself, right? So the whole discourse around female sexuality is weird. And it's probably not surprising that works of popular culture that reflect common ideas about female sexuality, such as romance, are also somewhat weird about it, right? So, weird story time. When I was 19, so that was 10 years ago, I was working several jobs, and one of them was to read books in English and then give my review of them to a major Russian publishing office so that they could decide whether or not to translate and publish them. And one day my job was to review 2 books in a series called This Man. The series is a BDSM erotic romance clearly inspired by 50 Shades of Grey, and for the 19-year-old me who'd never had a boyfriend, it was a shock. It was the first time I ever read anything so graphic, and more than half of the book was explicit sex scenes, with little to no consent. I specifically remember the character's first, encounter, and I remember thinking that it felt forced and completely unrealistic. Am I supposed to enjoy that? Is there something wrong with me if I don't want to? Frankly, I was scared. And of course the male lead was one huge red flag, a controlling obsessive psychopath, and an alcoholic. I went back to reread my reviews of the books now, and it was so funny because I was very snarky in them, merciless even, despite being 19 years old and, according to some critics, not having the cognitive capacity of recognizing problematic tropes as a young, impressionable girl. Of course, my verdict was that Russian readers wouldn't enjoy these kinds of books, and that I was shocked that some people abroad ever did, because the books had rave reviews on Goodreads. And my boss said that she totally agreed with me, and we both shook our heads disapprovingly at the women who enjoy these kinds of books. Now I know better than to shame anyone for enjoying what I don't enjoy. But back then, those books made me worry, because they really did feel like women enjoying the bonds of their oppression and accepting men's toxic behaviors just so that they can experience pleasure. At the first glance, these new adult BDSM-ish dark erotica romances really do seem to be stories about enjoying male domination. Sure, you could argue that the hero is tamed at the end, because he usually is. You could also argue that he's an outlet for the reader's aggression and trauma, but I think there is definitely something more to it. Another reason why being ordered around by a powerful and domineering man is such a powerful sexual fantasy. There has to be a reason, for example, why these books seem to perpetuate all these dangerous ideas around consent, such as, if your body responded to the act, it means you wanted it. Sure, you could argue that that's all just kink or personal preference, but the 50 Shades trilogy sold 150 million copies just by October 2017. This is, or was, popular culture. And one of the reasons why male domination and non-consent seem to be such powerful sexual fantasies might be because consent is actually not as easy as we think it is. Or rather, it might eventually become easy and straightforward for those who have developed a healthy attitude towards sex. But as you might imagine, a healthy attitude is not what our societies teach us. And romance heroines are written to reflect those unhealthy attitudes because that's what makes them relatable to readers. There is a scene in the first chapters of 50 Shades of Grey where Anna is overcome with her desire for Christopher, and yet she doesn't even think of acting upon it. What she does instead is try to will him telepathically to kiss her, and then she's very disappointed and even feels rejected when he doesn't. Shoujo romance manga protagonists keep worrying whether their love interest will think that they're nymphomaniacs if they initiate a kiss by themselves or something. And the media that actually do show female characters making the first move, or going after their own desires, which happens quite often in some Korean webtoons, for example, get so much hate and disgusting jokes in the comments. Women are taught that their sexuality is shameful, and that having desires makes them slutty, and consenting to something means admitting that you want it to happen, which is a problem if you think that as a true lady you shouldn't want it to happen. When you are ashamed of lust, consent requires opening up, being honest about your desires, and letting go of shame. So a person who thinks that their desire is shameful might feel uncomfortable and vulnerable when asked for consent. What if the other person thinks you're too easy? Admitting that you really want something makes you vulnerable. It actually takes courage. Consent takes courage. And that's quite tragic because the shame around female sexuality might be directly harming healthy consent culture. Need I remind you that in real life, consent is absolutely necessary if you don't want anyone to get hurt. But in romantic fantasy, dubious consent or even non-consent only leads to pleasure and fun and at least 10 mind-blowing orgasms a night. It's a fantasy of being able to achieve pleasure without having to confront the shame of having desires. First, as ContraPoints argues in her video about Twilight, what she calls the slut stigma of sexuality is the reason why the fantasy of non-consent is so popular amongst women in fiction, fanfiction, and even in their own private fantasies, because it allows them to remain pure and innocent. It gives the woman permission to keep her good girl status by being made to participate in this deliciously horrible thing. The non-consent fantasy is nothing like the actual SA, because the person who actually gives consent is the one who fantasizes. It is the reader. Because the whole thing is a fantasy, we usually know or assume that the heroine wants the thing to happen, because we can read her thoughts, for example. Consent requires vulnerability and communication and bravery on all sides. In real life, good sex is impossible without good communication, but communication requires opening up. Opening up is hard and uncomfortable. In real life, to get what you desire, you need to figure out what you desire first, and then communicate it to the other person. But that's embarrassing and uncomfortable, so some people end up being silent for years, trapped in their shame and unsatisfied desire, afraid to admit what they really want. Wouldn't it be just so much easier if the other person could just read your mind? If they could just understand what it is that you desire without you having to speak, without you having to even figure out what it is that you desire in the first place. It sounds like cheating, because in real life, people don't read minds. But in fantasy, they do. In romantic fantasy, there's a hero who can conveniently read the heroine's mind and give her everything she wants without her having to ask. No need to confront your shame, no need to communicate, no need to do anything, in fact. This perfect masculine sex machine can cater to all your wishes. In fact, he already knows all of them, because he's so experienced and so competent, and of course, your soulmate, that's certainly a bonus. No need to have to talk to him about why your desire also matters. He cares about your desire more than his own. No vulnerability, no shame, no uncomfortable conversations, no fear of rejection, just a shortcut to pure pleasure that is just bestowed upon you by someone else without you having to take any responsibility at all. And since this someone loves you and already knows what you desire, there's no need for explicit consent. They already know what you secretly want and won't do things that you secretly don't want. You're soulmates, therefore what he wants is what you want. In real life, consent is the basis of gender equality. But gender equality is still kind of new to us. We still haven't figured out how it works, because all we know is traditional gender roles. Illouz argues that in real life, heterosexual romantic love is in crisis. Everything we've been told about love and romance is creepy and weird and doesn't seem to work anymore. We know that traditional gender roles are problematic and that we should rethink them, but we don't seem to know how. As she puts it, current heterosexuality is pushed and pulled between still powerful norms of heteronormativity and an assault on gender roles and identities, meaning that with the advancement of feminism, we began to rethink gender identities and romantic relationships. Yet, all we know is how romance with traditional gender roles works. We don't even know what heterosexual relationships are supposed to look like now, because we only have the bad examples and none of the good. We don't know how we're supposed to love men. We don't know how equality works in relationships, because we only know examples of inequality. We have to figure it all out. How do we relationship without falling back to the atavistic patterns of the past? What kinds of behaviors are problematic and should be addressed? What's true consent supposed to look like? How do we make it sexy? Should it be a 20-page contract? Is a nod enough? And what is love anyway? How do marriage and kids fit into all of this? Real-life romantic relationships are difficult because we still haven't figured out how to play the game under new rules. We don't even know what the new rules are. All these questions create ambivalence about the nature of romantic relationships. If there is no clarity about how both parties contribute to it, it creates uncertainty and anxiety about its nature and the reason to stick together in the first place. Both parties don't actually need each other to survive. Ideally, you stay together because of love, but love is hard to define. But there is no uncertainty in the world of smutty romances with dominant men. No anxiety, no fear, because inequality is so pleasurable in its clarity. Inequality provides clear gender roles. Before, men were charged with protecting women in exchange for sex and domestic services. So it was a clear codependent relationship based on duty, and there was pleasure to be found in that kind of clarity. Gender role-playing is fun and easy because you can stop overthinking everything. Illouz says that gender roles generate emotions that are more spontaneous and immediate, because well-scripted social roles do not require negotiation or even reflexiveness, a capacity to reflect on the relation itself while it is unfolding. Meaning that when you have clear gender roles and no need for consent, desire is easily ignited when you don't have to think about its nature. But it only works in the space of fantasy, because in real life, patriarchy comes with nasty side effects of unhappiness for everyone. Dominant smutty romances, feminist ideas, and patriarchal norms are kind of mixed and matched in a perfect, soothing smoothie. Illouz argues that the longing for the sexual domination of man is not a longing for their social domination as such. Rather, it is a longing for the mood of sociality in which love and sexuality did not produce anxiety, negotiation, and uncertainty. The reason inequality seems to continue to haunt our fantasies is because we still haven't figured out how equality works. Sometimes it seems so far away that even fantasies have to revert to the same old, same old. Chapter 5. Harmful Media. In other words, the reason why romance can be so weird and seem problematic, the reason why it sometimes reflects traditional gender roles, is because of the unfinished nature of the feminist revolution. It's because gender inequality is still very real. This is the reason for the "I would never tolerate this man's behavior in real life, but I can't get enough of it in books" kind of romance. Think back to all the points we've discussed so far. One of the reasons why the heroes in romance are sometimes such red flag characters might be because they represent the reader's patriarchally induced fears and anxieties as villains to be defeated and saved with love. But also the reason why love, kindness, and understanding are the heroine's typical weapons is because under patriarchy, women's equality is only somewhat recognized in love. You can only be recognized as a human being if you get a man to fall in love with you. It might seem strange that we like to engage in this fantasy. Some might even argue that it's all because of our internalized misogyny. But I think it's something different. I think that it's a reflection of our anxiety around gender inequality, because it's actually somewhat soothing to think that even if all of our rights are taken away, we will still be able to change the world with the power of love and empathy. You could argue that being able to wield the power of empathy and understanding is an imaginary consolation prize in this scenario, unlike the real powers of money and violence. Or you could say that the idea that empathy is not a real power is rooted in misogyny because it's women who are expected to wield it. I think we have to be really careful here with our standards of strength and agency. But that discussion probably requires a separate video, or even a couple of them. And why is it always men who need saving from themselves anyway? Why don't we normally see angry and aggressive heroines whose souls need to be saved? Or gentle and kind heroes who do the emotional labor? Could it be because the gender roles that are placed upon us are so strong that we can't even fantasize about reversing them? And could it be that the reason why sexual fantasies of male domination are so popular because we are too ashamed of our own sexuality to take responsibility for our own pleasure? You see, all these problematic elements of romance are the symptoms of hundreds of years of societal structures that have only started to become loose. They are the symptoms, but not the cause. Among critics, romance is considered an unworthy form of literature, despite being the most popular genre. As Margaret Doody puts it, romance is most often used in literary studies to allude to forms conveying literary pleasure the critic thinks readers would be better off without. Romance readers are ashamed of their hobby and sometimes choose not to bring it up, especially if they enjoy the problematic kind of romance. It seems like romance is usually being critiqued for two things: for being unrealistic and for perpetuating problematic tropes and behaviors. But these two critique points also seem to be kind of at odds with each other. Think about it. If we critique romance for a bad representation of reality, then why should we care whether or not it's problematic, if it doesn't represent reality well anyway? I think that the reason why people have so many problems with romance, aside from the fact that it's enjoyed by women of course, and therefore requires extra careful examination, is that I think romance is both fantasy and not fantasy enough. You probably wouldn't care about the unrealistic representation of dragons in Game of Thrones, because dragons don't actually exist in real life, they're pure fantasy. But romantic relationships do exist in real life, and the fantasy representation of them bothers people because they're both real and not real enough. And that's okay. In general, I'd rather we all pay attention to how relationships are portrayed in the media than just ignore them as having little importance. But we should also remember that products of popular culture are not meant to be realistic. They are meant to be fun and entertaining. You don't want to escape into a world that's exactly like your real life, because it wouldn't be fun. And just to be clear, I'm not trying to defend any problematic behavior here, or make any excuses for any of the characters. A crime is a crime, and no soapy tragic backstory will make it less of a crime. And even if the toxic behavior is not real, even if it's fictional, it still matters. But it matters in a different way from reality. We absolutely should take it seriously even though it's fiction, but we shouldn't take it literally. Because fictional bad boys are not real and can't actually hurt us, we relate to them differently than to real-life bad boys. Their lives end the moment we close the book. Popular culture reflects the tensions and problems of the real world and incorporates them in a pleasurable narrative that helps the audience cope with those tensions and problems. Popular culture is a symptom, not the cause. Toxic romance storylines did not invent abusive relationships. They are not the reason why gender inequality exists. They are not the cause of sexism. They are a reflection of all those problems. And they provide a fantasy world that helps us cope with it. The perpetrators in abusive relationships are the abusers, and not the supposed romance-reading victims with pink smoothies instead of brains. Saying that problematic romance is harmful because it contributes to toxic relationships is the same thing as saying that miniskirts are harmful because they contribute to a say something. This concern for the minds of young impressionable girls who will end up choosing bad men because they read toxic romance, to me, is the same as victim blaming. We should stop underestimating romance readers and just assuming that they are dumb, gullible, and unable to separate fantasy from reality. It's true that popular culture contributes to shaping the way we see the world around us, because it represents the hegemonic ideology, or in other words, what people consider to be normal. However, that doesn't mean that the audience is incapable of interpreting the meanings that are to be found in popular texts in their own way, that they are unable to critically engage with stories. Because we're exposed to many more things than just products of popular culture. The things we're taught at school, the things our friends say, the things our parents taught us. All of it matters, too. When I read Twilight at the age of 15, I had no problem at all recognizing that some of Edward's problematic behavior is something that is not acceptable in real life. I knew that stalking is not okay, obsessive behavior is not okay, watching someone sleep is not okay, dating a guy who's 18 years older than you is not okay. Because even when I was 15, I found that the fantasy of romance contradicted the things I already knew about relationships. In fact, when I read Twilight, I didn't really care about Edward at all, or any of the male characters there. What I was interested in was Bella. I loved Bella, and I was fascinated with her emotions. I was captivated with the idea of falling in love and experiencing strong feelings like that. But I never idealized Edward just because I liked Twilight. Readers are not blank slates, and no single piece of media is enough to brainwash them. We know that romance is a fantasy, that's why we read it. Again, we don't need a reality check. Romance is a much more complex genre than people believe it to be. Romance is stories where you both defeat the powerful adversary, yet at the same time you are that adversary. It's narratives where power doesn't equal violence, where empathy and understanding rule the world, where desire is straightforward and safe from shame, and stories where happiness is a choice. Yet people treat romance as if all it is a myth of love. The narratives of romance are not meant to represent the ideal of perfect love. No, they portray relationships that are the most enjoyable to read about. And the male characters in romance do not represent what readers want in real life. No, they are the characters that are fun to read about. What we find fun to read about is shaped not only by our personal preferences, but also by our culture. I personally tend to enjoy the romance battle format, but I also like problematic characters as a means of exploring the darker sides of the human psyche. But I also personally dislike dominant submissive power dynamics, because I just find them boring, and I dislike full-on non-cons because they make me uncomfortable. But if you do enjoy the things I dislike, there's nothing wrong with you. Different people like different things, and that's okay. Because romance is not meant to be a role model for real relationships. It's not meant to be the trial run before the real thing either. Women who read problematic romance do not dream of patriarchy. They cope with it by reading stories that help them survive it. I think that as long as the idea of male domination exists, we will continue to engage in fantasy that somehow copes with it. And I actually think that will be okay. While I find the backlash against problematic romance to be unhelpful, because it shames both readers and authors, the fact that it's still there means that the world is changing. That the voices of people who are just sick of shadows of patriarchy in popular culture are becoming louder and louder, loud enough to become mainstream. While the pleasurable fantasy of problematic tropes may somehow help us cope with reality, stories that help us envision a better future are just as important, because we certainly won't be able to build a beautiful future if we can't even imagine it in the present. You have every right to dislike or criticize the depictions of problematic relationships, as long as you're respectful to the authors and readers, and as long as you realize that depicting something doesn't mean endorsing it, as long as you realize that if you are smart enough to recognize the problematic tropes, it means that other readers might be able to do the same thing too. However, if the popularity of these tropes makes you anxious and worried, I just want to reassure you that these narratives are a very normal reaction to the very imperfect world around us. And in my opinion, there is no reason to believe that these narratives are actually harmful. They are certainly not helpful either, but they are what they are, a symptom of our time. I think that we should spend more time celebrating the things we love, instead of bashing on the things that make us anxious. Thank you for listening.